Welcome everyone. Welcome to BCRES's webinar tonight. Quick little bit about the speakers here. So for those of you who don't know Chuck is a senior research associate at the University of Colorado's Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute, where he joined after spending 40 years at NREL, where he was the director of the Buildings and Thermal Sciences Center. Jeff Logan is the co-author of the report that's being discussed tonight and is currently an energy analyst over at NREL, where he's been for over a decade. Jeff has served in many energy analyst roles throughout his career, including for the International Energy Agency and for the World Resources Institute. We've been super excited to have both of them come present. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Chuck.
Terrific. Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction and welcome everybody. I hope everybody is doing well, surviving the pandemic. I know a lot of us have been attending all sorts of webinars, and so they're getting kind of old, so I really appreciate folks, tuning in and coming out for this particular webinar. I'm going to be covering this report, Accelerating the Clean Energy Transformation. I'll be presenting the slides. Before I get into that report, though, I wanted to remind folks of an earlier report. So. CRES, of course, is itself a chapter of the American Solar Energy Society. And back in 2006, we had a national solar conference in Denver that focused on climate change. And this 200-page report was an outgrowth of that conference. So ASIS has been involved in this climate change issue for a while, both as a national organization and through its chapters. In this report, we did sort of a bottom-up study. We had a bunch of volunteers do a bottom-up study of how all the different renewables and efficiency could reduce U.S. carbon emissions. And it showed, in fact, that by 2030, we could be well on the path to getting off carbon by mid-century. The report I'm going to cover today is a new report, and it's this one. And there's actually three of us co-authors, in addition to Jeff and myself. Tim Coburn was one of the authors. I'm going to give the slides today, but at the end of this presentation, Jeff is going to help me answer some questions. So if you look at what's causing climate change, this is according to the EPA. These are U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. This is a chart from 2017, but the basic division hasn't changed much. And the point here is that if you look at what's putting these greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, these gases that trap the outgoing infrared radiation and that are warming the planet, 75% of them are due to burning fossil fuels. Now so our report focuses on that. Now that doesn't mean the other 25% isn't important. I mean, cows belching methane and all the other things that we need to deal with. We need to do it all. But our particular report focused on what we see as the biggest problem, and that is fossil fuel combustion. So this is a quick outline of the report. And again, what we did was we looked at energy-related CO2 emissions, and those are shown in the parentheses. So our report, and at the end, I'll give you a link to the report. You can download the PDF. But we start with a background and a rationale. Why is climate change important? Why do we need to address it? And then we cover the four sectors: electricity, buildings, transportation, and industry. And at the end, we give at least an overview of the idea of pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, because as you'll see in a slide I present later, we need to be doing that as well. So if you look at this, how these different sectors divide up, you might say, well, gosh, buildings doesn't look that important. It's only 12%. That's kind of misleading, because electricity is not really an end use. It's an energy carrier, and 3/4 of that electricity goes into buildings. The other 25% goes into industry. So if you take that electricity and you allocate it to where the electricity goes, so the emissions that result from producing electricity, if you attribute them to where the electricity goes, we wind up with this split. And you can see it's roughly about equal between buildings and transportation. They're both about 35, 37%. Industry is a little bit under 30%, but all three are really important. All right, so I'm going to go through each section. First, the background and rationale. I think most of you have seen in the last few years that we're really experiencing climate change now. It's not something we're just worried about in the future. And a lot of people have said, you know, we've reached this new normal. I like to call it the new abnormal, because a new normal kind of suggests that, well, yeah, things have changed, but they've reached a new steady state. In fact, it's constantly changing. And so what we see is all these different events. Extended drought like we've had in the Southwest. You've seen wildfires. I mean, last year, the Pine Gulch fire outside of Grand Junction set the record for wildfires in Colorado. That record was broken 1 month later in Colorado. Flooding, hurricanes. Here in Colorado, I'm always amazed when I go into the mountains at how many trees have died due to bark beetle kill. Which is a function of the extended drought we've seen, and then coral bleaching. And of course, you've seen what happened in Texas recently. We're getting this cold Arctic weather move down south more frequently. So now all this is happening with about a 2-degree Fahrenheit temperature rise. That's the temperature rise of the planet that we've experienced, again, mainly because we're burning these fossil fuels. Now, you might say, well, yeah, is 2 degrees enough to be causing all these problems? One thing to understand is that not only that 2 degrees is an average global temperature rise. In fact, it's been very non-uniform. The Arctic, for various reasons, the Arctic has warmed much more than the mid-latitudes. So it's this temperature gradient from the mid-latitudes to the poles that drives weather systems. That temperature gradient has really decreased, and that has really wreaked havoc on weather patterns. So if you look at billion-dollar disaster events, this is a chart from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and this chart shows billion-dollar events, and you can see that they're all different types here of events, but you can see in general there's a clear increase in these events. You know, for many decades, we were spending about $50 billion a year on these big disaster events. We've had some years now where the annual cost has exceeded $300 billion. So there are enormous economic consequences to climate change. One way to address this is to come up with what's called an SCC, or social cost of carbon. And in the US, an interagency working group came up with a number of about $42 per metric ton of CO2. Metric ton is 1,000 kilograms. And the Biden administration is pushing for something more like $51, $52, maybe higher than that. This is, I think, a very impressive study that was in the literature where they looked at each country and calculated a cost of carbon in each country. What's the cost of the damage in that country? And then they added up all the damages to get the true global cost. So this was a very granular study. It came up with $417 per metric ton. So that's about 10 times what the US government has been assuming is the social cost of carbon. And to put that in perspective, if that $417 per ton of CO2 turned into a tax on gasoline, it would be $3.71 a gallon. Now, another thing to keep in mind when we get off fossil fuels, there's plenty of other benefits, not just climate change. So this is a recent study. This is about a year old. Air pollution from fossil fuels costs $8 billion per day. Now, that's annually. If you look at the US, it's about $600 billion a year. That's the cost of the healthcare costs associated with burning fossil fuels and putting all these pollutants in the air. And that's caused an estimated almost 250,000 premature deaths per year in the US. So the point is, if we stop burning fossil fuels, even if other countries don't address the climate change problem, we win just from stopping fossil fuels and stopping air pollution associated with them. There's been a lot of talk recently about the social equity, social justice. In fact, if you look at low-income communities, where are they located? They're located the same places where polluting fossil fuel plants and other industry are located. And when they decide to run a highway through a city, guess what neighborhoods they run the highway through? It's the low-income neighborhoods. So as we get off fossil fuels, as we convert from gasoline cars to electric cars, it's greatly going to benefit low-income communities. Because of that pollution, they suffer lots of childhood asthma, premature deaths among seniors. So getting off fossil fuel is a great way to move us towards social equity. And then finally, when we switch from fossil fuels to clean energy, there's a huge job potential. You can see here that already clean energy employs 3 times as many people as fossil fuels. All right, so what's the number one goal? The number one thing we have to do is stop burning fossil fuels. We have to drive those fuel emissions to zero as rapidly as we possibly can. So here are the basic steps that are needed. First, we need to do everything we can to use less energy. We're going to talk about electrifying buildings and transportation. The more efficient we make these things, the less new electricity we need to add. But we need to electrify everything we can. In those cases where we can't electrify, we look for low carbon fuels, and I'll talk about that. We need to rapidly deploy solar, wind, and storage to help make up for the variable nature of solar and wind. Why? Because they are now the cheapest forms of electricity, and I'll show that shortly. We need to employ what's called demand flexibility to allow the demand or the use of electricity to better match the variable supply of solar and wind. And then finally, we're going to need to do something to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. But we have to do that in a way that doesn't interfere with driving fossil fuel emissions to zero. That's an important thing to remember. All right, so of the 4 sectors, the first one I'm going to cover is the electricity sector. If you look at net U.S. electricity generation, you can see that we've made this transition from coal to natural gas and renewables. And in fact, renewables now exceed nuclear in terms of the electricity production in the U.S. So renewables have made a big advance. And the good thing about this transition is it's the only one of the 4 sectors where we really have reduced emissions. So renewables, solar and wind, now surpass coal and nuclear, or all renewables do, I should say. Now, if you look at emissions, you can see that, yes, coal has come down, but unfortunately, natural gas has gone up. So in a lot of ways, natural gas is the new coal. And when you look at the fact that fugitive methane emissions from natural gas are a really big greenhouse gas, much more powerful than CO2, you can see that it's not enough to get off coal. We've got to get off natural gas as well. All right, so how do we do that? Here are wind farms. We have wind farms on land, offshore wind, big in Europe, just starting in the US. That's a 30 megawatt plant off Block Island in the Northeast, off Rhode Island. And then solar photovoltaics, central utility scale, rooftop PV, and sort of the intermediate so-called solar gardens or community solar. We need it all. Now, I mentioned that we only have the one offshore wind project, but that has really generated a lot of interest in offshore wind. And so this just came out yesterday that this Martha's Vineyard project, Vineyard Wind, got its final environmental review and has been approved for this 800 megawatt offshore project. So we're seeing offshore wind really take off. And offshore wind is important because it's strong wind and very steady wind. So they have basically what you call high capacity factors. This is what's happened to the price of electricity from solar and wind. And I'll tell you, as someone who's worked in the renewable energy field for over 40 years, I never anticipated that in the last 10 years we'd see drops like this. So this is from a study that's done annually by Lazard, and you can see the price of solar has declined 89% in just the last 10 years, and the price of onshore wind has decreased 70% in those 10 years. And now if you look at this, you can see that onshore wind and solar PV are cheaper than gas, geothermal, coal. They're basically about a quarter of the cost of a new nuclear power plant. This is for new electricity generation. So it's amazing how much they've come down. And I'm showing this graph to point out that not only do we have this huge drop in PV and the drop in both onshore and offshore wind costs, But look at what's happened to batteries. The drop in battery costs has been even steeper than the very steep drops in solar and wind. Now, 2020, last year, was a record year for U.S. solar and wind. Why was it a record? Well, two reasons. One, because it's so cheap now. It just makes economic sense when you're adding electric capacity to do it with solar and wind. But also because there was a threat of losing the tax incentives. And so they rushed to get projects out. And so you can see we installed 37 gigawatts combined of solar and wind in 2020. That's the record. Now, one thing we're going to be talking about, and we basically agree with the Biden administration position that we're aiming to get to a carbon-free electric grid in the United States in 14 years now, by 2035. What does that mean? To accomplish that, we need to basically do what we did in 2020, that record year, and install double that amount every year for the next 15 years. So basically, we need to install, instead of 37 gigawatts, on the order of about 80 gigawatts every year on average for the next 15 years. Now, that's a lot, but look, if you look at the seriousness of climate change and you look at that social cost of carbon, it makes perfect sense to do that. And if I told you, well, we have to do 10 times as much next year as we did in 2020, you'd say, well, that's ridiculous. We can't do that. But can we double it? I'm sure that we can do that if we set our minds to it. And also, there's a booming U.S. storage market. So you look here at this curve, and it shows you the front of the meter. That's the green. That means utility scale batteries. And then we have non-residential and residential projects. So this is really growing, and the projections are it's going to grow even faster. There's also some interesting new PV applications. There's agrivoltaics. You may be familiar with Jack's Solar Garden in Boulder. The idea here, you know, one of the things that helped wind take off was when farmers found out they could make money by allowing wind turbines on their land. That was a no-brainer for them. Well, here you can actually combine farmland or ranch land with PV. The shade is good for cattle. So there's certain advantages to commingling them. Photovoltaics is a newer concept also that involves putting PV mostly on reservoirs. And what that PV does is, first of all, it gets rid of the cost of the land, putting it on a reservoir. Second of all, it can reduce the evaporative loss from the reservoir. And then finally, you know, PV is more efficient the cooler it runs. So being on top of the water, it tends to keep it cooler, and so it's more efficient. All right, so look, the challenge is we're taking stuff like, you know, coal plants that run 24 hours a day, and now we have this variable source of electricity. The wind isn't always blowing, the sun isn't always shining. How do we integrate that on a large scale? Well, one thing we have going for us, if we deploy solar and wind together, they are actually quite complementary. This particular graph from Iowa shows on an annual basis the wind power output, which is the yellow curve, and the solar, which is the pink curve. I wish those colors were opposite. I think the yellow is being solar, but anyway, they are what they are. But what you can see is, of course, in the summer, the days are longer, there's more sunshine. And generally, the wind tends to blow stronger in the winter. So there's a real synergy there if you combine them. Same thing on a daily or diurnal basis. The wind, particularly in Colorado, but in many places, the wind tends to blow stronger at nighttime. And I guess most of you have noticed that the sun tends to shine more during the daytime. And so these are also complementary. So one of the things we do is we deploy them together. Another thing that helps is spatial diversity. So the wind may not be blowing in one place, it's blowing somewhere else. So this shows you two wind farms. The top is a small wind farm with 15 turbines. The bottom is a much bigger wind farm with 200 turbines. And you can look here at the output, and you can see you have a much steadier output from the bigger plant than from the smaller plant. Now, the logical extension of that is, what if we do what ERCOT in Texas couldn't do during that crisis last week? and that is move electricity around the country. So this was a study done at NREL, the SEAM study. It was held up for political reasons, but it finally came out. And this is the idea of moving electricity using high voltage DC transmission lines between the Western Interconnect and the Eastern Interconnect. And of course, we'd like to get Texas in there too. If utility operators can grab electricity from widely different areas, they can make up for this variability issue. All right, so in each of the 4 sectors, in our report, we make certain recommendations, and I haven't listed them all in this presentation. I don't think you need 200 word bullets. But what I'm showing here are a few key things from each section. So one of the things we advocate is a clean electricity standard, and we think there's generally a lot of support for that. Basically, a 100% carbon-free electric grid by 2035. That would be solar, wind, hydro, and keeping nuclear plants operating. New nuclear plants are very expensive, but we think it makes sense to keep existing nukes operating as long as we safely can because they save a lot of carbon emissions. Support this with a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Extend renewable energy tax credits and net metering. That's very important. Modernize the grid. I mentioned expanding transportation, and then look for ways to improve storage. We need to lower the cost of storage, and also we need to be able to store energy seasonally. Otherwise, we risk having to curtail solar and wind. Although solar and wind have gotten so cheap that in some cases, curtailment is the cheapest way to go. All right, the building sector. So I'm going to talk next about net zero energy buildings. This is something that NREL has worked a lot on. The main office building on the NREL campus in Golden is the research support facility. This is where I had my office. It's a very, very efficient building. It uses about half the energy of a modern code compliant building. And the way that was accomplished was using what's called performance-based acquisition. And NREL has actually published a manual on how to do this. The basic idea is you don't just go to the architect first. You have the architect bring in a builder, and you give the architect-builder team a specific energy goal, in this case, 25,000 BTUs per square foot of floor area per year. That's the energy goal. And guess what? If they have to bid a project to meet a certain energy goal, they figure out a way to do that. That goal was met, and in fact, this building was built in 2010 for a cost that's pretty typical per square foot in the Denver metro area. All right, so this is the building here, the research support facility. It's these 3 wings here. So it's very energy efficient. I don't have time in this presentation to go over all the various energy efficiency features. If you ever get a chance to tour this building, I highly recommend it. But in order to make it net zero, there needs to be enough renewable energy generation on the campus to make up for any fossil fuel that's used in this building, namely some natural gas for heating. And so basically there's a PV arrays on the main parking garage, the visitor canopy parking lot, and the 3 wings of the building. All these 3 together comprise about 2.5 megawatts of PV, and that makes that a net zero energy building. So one of the things we wanted to do at NREL is, it's great to have zero energy buildings, but we can't do this building by building. It'll take too long. So the idea is to go to all electric zero energy carbon districts. And there's actually several in Denver. And when I give several presentations on building energy, I get into the details of those. But I want to point out one here. This is a new community outside of Austin, Texas. Very, very energy efficient. It uses ground source heat pumps. And it has what's called an ambient loop, which is a new way to do district heating and cooling, where you have underground pipes carrying water, and all these different buildings communicate. You could have one building that needs heating while another building needs cooling, and you're moving heat between the buildings by virtue of this district heating loop. Now again, efficiency is still incredibly important, especially as we go to electrify buildings. We want to minimize the amount of electrification we have to do. And probably one of the greatest success stories for efficiency are the appliance efficiency standards. You know, the Energy Star program that EPA developed and EPA and DOE work on. And this shows you from 1980, in this case to 2017, the dramatic reductions that we've seen in the energy use of these different appliances. Refrigerators today use a quarter of the electricity that they used in the 1970s, and yet they cost less and they're actually bigger. So that's been a big success story, and under the new administration, we're looking to expand the efficiency standards to other appliances and make these even tighter. NREL's done a lot of work on looking at, in different locations, what makes the most sense from energy efficiency measures. And they have this for each state in the union, and I'm showing the result for Colorado. But it shows you starting with the most cost-effective and most productive energy efficiency measures on down. This has been developed for each state. And the city of Boulder has been using this particular computer program to get to determine the best energy efficiency measures for the various buildings within Boulder County. All right, so I mentioned we have to electrify as much as we can. Certainly buildings need to be electrified. Heat pumps have gotten so efficient that even in cold climates, they work very well. So if you use electric resistance heating, you use a certain amount of electricity to heat. If you switch to a heat pump, you basically use about a third of the electricity on average. And there's various electric appliances. There's heat pump water heater, like on the right. There's inductive stoves. A lot of people say, well, they like gas cooking. They don't like electric stoves. Inductive stoves are very, very good for cooking, and top chefs are now using electric inductive stoves. And there's even a heat pump dryer. Several different companies have heat pump dryers on the market, ventless heat pump dryers, where you don't even need to vent them to the outside. You just need to empty the water out of them after you dry your clothes. All right, so the other way that we deal with the variable nature of renewable electricity is to look at where that electricity gets used. Well, remember that 75% of electricity gets used by buildings. So what if we control buildings in a way that only uses that electricity when it's available from these renewable sources? So NREL has an entire building devoted to looking at this, and a lab where 3 different homes are represented, where they can look at how appliances can be scheduled to meet changing loads. And NREL and others have developed a home energy management system. This is NREL's variety of it that looks at ways to control all these different appliances in a way that takes into account customer preferences and comfort. And I also want to mention that, we used to say years ago that over a building's life, the amount of carbon emissions associated with the operating energy are way much bigger than the amount of carbon emissions associated with building the building. What this graph shows is, you can look at the operational carbon, and this is the amount of carbon you put in the atmosphere due to operating the building. It keeps growing because you add some more every year. So this is the cumulative amount. If you look at the embodied carbon, whatever you put in the atmosphere, that doesn't change. It doesn't accumulate. Whatever got put in when the building got built, it's there. But the point of this graph is we are trying within the next 10 years, 10 to 15 years, to address climate change. Within that time frame, the embodied emissions are important. And consider this. When we go to electric buildings, and those electric buildings use solar and wind electricity, what happens to these blue bars? They disappear. It winds up then that all the carbon emitted by the building is from the construction materials. So we really need to address that. All right, so building sector recommendations. We need to do better benchmarking of the performance of buildings and score them. Expand that Energy Star program and include home energy management so that these appliances are Wi-Fi enabled and can participate in this demand management. We think all new buildings should be all electric beginning just in the next couple of years. There are places like Berkeley and other cities in California and Massachusetts that have declared that new buildings can't use natural gas. So there's already municipalities that are doing this. And then shoot to have existing buildings electrified at least by the time that we have a carbon-free grid in 2035, if not sooner. as we add heat pumps, that's more refrigerants. And refrigerants today have large global warming potential. If they leak out, they're significant. And so we think it's important to develop low GWP refrigerants. And then the low carbon building materials I mentioned. All right, transportation sector. And I'm going to take a sip of water here. All right, if you look at the transportation sector, what you can see is that dark green is light duty vehicles. That's basically cars. And then the next shade of green over is medium and heavy duty trucks. Together, they represent almost 75% of the emissions due to the transportation sector. So look, we have a solution for those. Battery electric vehicles make a heck of a lot of sense. I myself owned a Chevy Bolt for 4 years. They're fast, they're quiet, they have virtually zero maintenance. So it really makes sense to continue along that path and accelerate our transition. And then we've basically handled most of the problem here. But still, there are these other sectors, and I want to talk about those as well. So one of the things that's happened with electric vehicles is the cost of EVs has come down. Why? Because the battery is a big part of the cost of the vehicle. My Chevy Bolt has 60 kilowatt hours of LG Chem batteries in the chassis. Nice to have that low weight. It's very good handling, low center of gravity. But those batteries are a significant cost element. Because when you think about it, basically an electric car gets rid of most of the stuff you have in a gasoline car, but you're left with the battery and the motor. And the battery is a big expense item. And so the battery cost, as I showed earlier, has come way down. And that means the cost of new electric vehicles has come way down. An electric vehicle today on a life cycle basis is already on parity with a gasoline car when you take into account the low maintenance costs. We're very close now, probably in the next 2 years, where a new electric vehicle will be cost competitive with a gasoline vehicle, even on first cost. Now, generally, where do you charge your electric vehicle? You do it at home in your garage. Most of us don't drive more than 20, 30 miles a day or so. But occasionally you go on long trips and you want to be able to keep your car going. And so EV fast charging stations are important. This is the Electrify America network. This is what Volkswagen's penalty for cheating with their diesel emissions. And they have now built out 2 coast-to-coast fast charging networks. And those of you who may own Teslas I know Jeff, who's my co-author and is going to help me answer questions at the end. He drives a Tesla Model 3. And when he goes on trips, the Tesla fast charging network is just fantastic. The other chargers can't really approach that yet, but they're getting there. So what we really need to do is push and incentivize this transition. You may have seen that GM a few weeks ago said that all their new cars will be completely electric by 2035. Well, Volkswagen just got out ahead of them and said all their vehicles are going to be zero carbon or fully electric by 2030. Well, in terms of countries, you can see that Norway is looking to be 100% new electric vehicles by 2025. So they're really in the lead. So it gives you an idea how aggressive this is becoming. And I just want to point out, if you have a better technology, rapid adoption can take place. And some of you may have seen this slide. I think Amory Lovins and others have used these pictures. But it's really interesting. On the left, this is the Easter Sunday parade on Fifth Avenue in New York City. On the left is 1900, on the right is 1913. And basically, if you really scour these photographs, on the left, it's all horse-drawn carriages except for one car. And on the right, it's all cars except for one horse-drawn carriage. So within that 13-year period, there was a massive transition. And this required building out gas stations. Think of all the changes that occurred. But it occurred in great part because, look, a gasoline car made a lot more sense than a horse-drawn carriage for a lot of reasons. But also, as it is now, we're looking at a pollution problem. In that case, it wasn't air pollution, it was street pollution from the horses. And so these two things drove this very rapid transition, and I anticipate a very rapid transition from gasoline vehicles to electric vehicles. So what about trains? Certainly we want to electrify trains. We have electric light rail in Denver. That's great. When you get to long distance, if they're not along electric transmission corridors, if it's not too great a distance, you can use battery electrics. But for long distances, you may need hydrogen fuel cells. Now, one thing that's been proposed, remember how I said we need to increase the transmission of electricity around the country? One of the challenges in doing that is finding rights of way and getting those rights of way to run the transmission lines. Well, look, we already have rights of way along railroads. So we could conceivably increase transmission by running that transmission along railroad lines. And that's something that's actually being pursued. If we do that and electric lines are running along the railroad lines, then in fact, there's electricity for those trains to tap into. Otherwise, we can look at hydrogen fuel cell electric trains. And that one that I just showed you is actually a project in UK. What about electric ships? Well, for battery electric ships, batteries are pretty heavy. They take up a lot of cargo space. And so it makes more sense for battery electric ships to be working within harbors. And all the existing electric ships so far are not transatlantic or transoceanic ships. But there's experiments going on with hydrogen there also, and running ships long distance with hydrogen. And one of the ways to store hydrogen, storing hydrogen is an issue. One thing you can do is store it in the form of ammonia. So ammonia is NH3, and so when you add nitrogen to hydrogen, you add a lot of weight to it, but actually you decrease the volume. You decrease it greatly compared to pressurized storage of hydrogen, and significantly even compared to cryogenic hydrogen. So for long distance shipping, people are looking at hydrogen fuel and possibly storing it in the form of ammonia. So, I meant of the different sectors, it's generally agreed that the sector that's the hardest to electrify is industry. But within transportation, the hardest part of transportation to electrify is air travel. And so there are various approaches to what are called sustainable aviation fuels. Sometimes used, the acronym SAF is used. And this gives you an example. This shows you one comparison of two different things. On the bottom, a lot of people are talking about biofuels for air transport. And on the top are what are called liquid e-fuels or electrofuels. And essentially what the e-fuels are is you use renewable energy, you produce green hydrogen through electrolysis. I'll cover that more when I get into the next section on industry. You combine it with carbon monoxide, you form synfuel, and then you can produce all these various hydrocarbon fuels as a result. And the carbon you get is from maybe from cement plants or pulling it out of the atmosphere or in other ways. So this compares those two alternatives. Again, most people are pursuing the bottom now, but the point of this graphic, which was done by the European Union, is that there's a lot of land required for those biofuels, much less land for the drop-in liquid e-fuels. What this graphic doesn't show you, though, is there's when you take electricity and you produce hydrogen by electrolysis, there's some energy penalty. You might lose 30% or so when you do that. When you go from the green hydrogen to the e-fuels, there's a big drop, a big efficiency penalty. So it doesn't show it here, but you have to generate lots of renewable electricity to produce e-fuels. So here's another alternative, and this is what Airbus is pursuing. Airbus is looking at actually hydrogen powered. So you're not taking the hydrogen and producing e-fuels, you're using the hydrogen directly on airplanes. In this particular case, in a jet engine. And then you would store the hydrogen likely in the form of cryogenic hydrogen on the plane. All right, our transportation recommendations. We're doing great with battery electric light duty vehicles. Let's get them, all the new ones, electric by 2030. And look for heavy duty vehicles to be net zero by 2040. Look for ways like a cash for clunkers program to aid low income purchasers convert to EVs. Once they do, we'll have very low maintenance costs and low fuel costs, particularly if they have a rooftop PV. Expand the charging network, develop hydrogen, ammonia, and e-fuels. I didn't cover this, but we covered in our section, but promote transportation mode shifting. As we've seen during this pandemic, where a lot of people, of course, are telecommuting, I think we've learned a lot about how we can get by without typical transportation, and then expand high-speed rail. All right, this is the last of the four sectors. The industrial sector, this is from the EIA, Energy Information Administration. These are CO2 emissions from the different industries. And so in our report, we cover a little bit about chemicals. We cover steel, we cover cement. Obviously, a lot of energy gets used for refining, but as we get off fossil fuels, that piece of the pie chart is going to go away. So if you look at what is used by industry, this pie chart shows it's pretty divided more or less close into thirds, where a third of it is natural gas, a third of it is oil, and a third of it is already electricity. So what we're trying to do is electrify these other sectors, these other portions that are using fossil fuel. So there's lots of ways you can use electric heating. And I should point out that when you look at industrial energy, the bulk of it is process energy, high temperatures generated, in some cases, thousands of degrees Fahrenheit to produce these industrial products. And so we can switch from gas and coal and oil to these various ways to do electric heating. And so here's an example of concrete manufacture. Now, in concrete manufacture, you can see that there's carbon emissions associated with actually producing cement. It turns out 2/3 of the emissions are producing cement, because what you're doing is you're breaking down limestone to produce the actual cement, the Portland cement. And so carbon dioxide gets released when you do that. But there's also fossil fuel that's needed to get to these high temperatures for processing it, and that could use electricity. So how can you reduce emissions in concrete production? To get rid of the process emissions, you want to process less limestone. So there's various supplementary materials that are used to replace the limestone. For the heating, instead of using fossil fuels, you would use an electric, so-called arc plasma heating, or use hydrogen. And I'm going to talk, I mentioned hydrogen briefly in the transportation section, and I'll cover that more of that in a minute. And then you got a lot of CO2 released from the limestone decomposition in the cement, or so-called clinker binder production. And you can capture that CO2 and form products out of it. You can sequester it. You could use it for e-fuels. So there's various things you could do with that CO2. All right, so when we talk about hydrogen, it's important that we're talking about green hydrogen. Now, 95% or more of hydrogen produced today comes from steam reformation of natural gas. And so it's not carbon-free. We're talking about carbon-free hydrogen, and that means splitting water, H2O, into hydrogen and oxygen, and using that hydrogen. That's green hydrogen, and that's what we need to do. So this is what Bloomberg estimated, looking at, and this is looking out at the year 2050 actually. So it assumes some reduction in the cost of electrolyzers. But they say, what sort of a tax would we have to put on carbon to make hydrogen cost effective for these various things. And you can see that, transportation is down here. But again, I think, a lot of transportation, we can use battery electric. Some will use hydrogen. Steel, and then cement, and then ammonia production, and then aluminum. And you can see you go up the line here. But I want you to look at this graph. Notice that the highest price on here is $180 per ton of CO2. Do you remember early in my presentation when I showed you what the real social cost of carbon dioxide probably is? $417 per metric ton. All these costs are way below the actual social cost of carbon. In other words, from a total economic sense, any of these things make sense. Steel manufacture. One of the challenges in steel manufacture is if you're using recycled steel, you can use an electric arc furnace. That's already electrified. That's great. But if you're starting with iron ore, raw iron, that contains iron oxides, and you need to separate the oxygen out of the iron before you can put the iron ore in the electric arc furnace. Coal is now burned in order to do that. But there's a lot of work now looking to get rid of that. And here's a process, and this is developed by Vattenfall in Sweden. On the left, you see the conventional thing where you take coke, coal, you burn it, and basically the carbon in the coal captures the oxygen. So it reduces the iron ore to give you pure iron. So instead of the coal, what you can do is use hydrogen. So the hydrogen reduces the iron ore, the hydrogen grabs the oxygen and produces water. So instead of giving off CO2, what do you get? You get water. And so that's a process called hybrid. And there's a plant in Sweden that was built and is now basically doing fossil-free steel using that method and using green hydrogen. So there's a group called Energy Innovation. They have an interesting modeling site where you can go and run their model and change the inputs under different set of assumptions. This is a model that looks out, going out to mid-century in this case, looking at how you can get to a net zero in the whole economy. So we're looking for the electricity sector to be zero carbon by 2035, and we're looking for the whole economy, including industry and everything else, to be net zero by 2050. So this particular view of assumptions to get us to net zero by 2050 wound up with, by 2050, about half of the industrial energy being hydrogen and half of it being electricity. I don't know if that's the right mix. I would like to think we can do maybe more with electricity and less with hydrogen. It's more efficient to use the electricity directly than it is to produce hydrogen. But this is what this particular model came up with, and I think we'll see some combination of this in the future. And some of you, I spent a lot of my career in solar thermal, solar heating, and I just want to mention briefly that the one case here in decarbonization that can make a big impact is if you look at process energy requirements. Most process steam is less than about 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And so most of it is down in this region. These are different things at different temperatures. And so this heat could be provided by concentrating solar collectors, relatively inexpensive concentrating solar collectors. And so what you're looking for is, where is there a lot of industry that has process heat, but also lots of what's called direct normal irradiance, clear sky, solar radiation, that could be concentrated by a concentrating collector. And where do you have that? California Central Valley is perfect for it. Lots of natural gas used for all sorts of process industries there. And then lots of direct normal irradiance. It's perfect for using solar industrial process heat. And this is actually a project, the Frito-Lay Solar Industrial Process Heat Plant in Modesto, California. Many of you might have known Ken May, who worked for Abengoa before that with Industrial Solar Technologies, and before that at NREL, SERI in those days. And Ken was a friend. He unfortunately passed away in a climbing accident last October. But he was a big contributor to solar IPH. And this is a plant that he designed. And I actually got to get involved in this plant a little bit. and it produces hot oil to produce potato chips. So industry recommendations, looking at federal efficiency standards to get key industry equipment to be developed carbon-free, R&D to convert furnaces to electricity and hydrogen. This is not trivial. When you burn natural gas in a furnace, it burns at a certain temperature and it gives you a certain heat flux distribution. When you switch to electricity, you got to add a lot of electric power to the plant. You have to design it so the heat flux gets uniformly distributed or however you need it distributed. And the same with hydrogen. Hydrogen burns at a different temperature than natural gas. It's very different to deal with. So equipment has to be redesigned. Looking at R&D to reduce the cost of green hydrogen, in particular, drive down the cost of electrolyzers. Look at carbon pricing, that if our industry converts to these carbon-free methods, which has some cost associated with it, we want them to still be competitive in the international market. And then I mentioned the solar thermal. All right, so now the last section, this is just a very brief overview. And this is, sometimes it's called negative emissions, or also called carbon dioxide removal, or CDR methods. So why do we need this? If you look at these various plots of net CO2 emissions to get us to different temperatures, and God help us if we get up to 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, which is, like 7 and 8 degrees Fahrenheit. We've seen what 2 degrees Fahrenheit does. Can you imagine what 7 or 8 degree Fahrenheit temperature rise would do to the planet? So we're really striving to get down below 2 degrees C. And what these curves show is at some point, we got to get to where we're actually have net negative emissions. We're emitting less than we're taking out of the atmosphere. And so there's a lot of interest in this. Now, you could say, well, we're going to drive fossil fuel emissions to zero, and then we're actually going to start removing CO2 from the atmosphere and geologically burying it. That's the best thing we can do. There may be some things that are hard to decarbonize. And so people are talking about, well, for the things that we can't decarbonize, we can more or less do this CO2 removal from the atmosphere to make up for it. That's a slippery slope because it's easy for industry to use that as an excuse. Well, we're not going to decarbonize because we want to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. It's much cheaper to get off fossil fuels and go to electricity and hydrogen than it is to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So we have to be very careful about that. So here are the various ways. One of the key things we have to do is stop deforestation. It's a real scourge on the planet. But also we have reforestation, growing forests again where forests have been removed, and afforestation, new forests. And then there's various ways, generally in agriculture, to be better stewards of the soil, to use no-till agriculture and use other techniques that maintain microbe-rich soils that trap the carbon. There's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. This is something Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has touted a lot. There's biochar. For those of you who know Ron Larson, a member of CRESS, he's an expert in biochar and a big proponent of biochar use. There's enhanced weathering. So over very geologic time periods, what happens is silica rocks pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. They form bicarbonates. If we could take that material and spread it out on the land or on the ocean, some people are arguing that that's a way to accelerate that process. And finally, there's direct air capture. Now, the challenge there is carbon dioxide is 0.04% of the air. It's a trace gas. It's a tiny amount, even though it's a powerful greenhouse gas, it's a very tiny gas in the atmosphere. What that means is you got to move humongous quantities of air to capture enough CO2. So there's fan power associated with that. But even more than that, what happens is you use various sorbents where the carbon dioxide gets adsorbed onto the surface of these sorbents. Ultimately, after you get the carbon dioxide into the sorbents, you got to bake it out so that you can then pressurize it and bury it geologically. That takes energy. So it's generally assumed that for direct air capture, maybe 80% of the energy is the heat needed for regeneration, and 20% is the fan power. You could use solar thermal energy, you could use geothermal energy, but you want to make sure that when you do this direct air capture, you're not using renewable electricity that could otherwise be used to displace fossil fuels, because that's way more effective use of renewable energy. So this is a simple plot from a paper that shows on the y-axis is the cost per ton of capturing the CO2, and on the x-axis is the potential carbon storage in billions of tons of CO2 per year. And you can see the most expensive is direct air capture on the top. But of course, depending on how many plants you build, you could do a lot with it. You can see afforestation and deforestation are probably the lowest cost ones. And then there's various ones in between. So anyway, those are the different approaches. And again, you got to be careful that this says too many companies are banking on carbon capture to reach net zero. Again, you don't want to distract society from driving fossil fuel emissions to zero. Carbon CO2 removal from the atmosphere is not a get out of jail free card. It's something that you use in addition to driving fossil fuel emissions to zero. So our CDR, carbon dioxide removal recommendations, provide financial incentives to reduce deforestation. Maybe we need to pay countries like Brazil to stop burning down forest and converting it to cattle and other purposes, or Indonesia, where they're burning down forests and planting oil palms. Perform a total social environmental cost benefit analysis of all these biological methods. One of the problems with these biological methods is you really have to draw your system boundary wide and look at, okay, if I'm using crop residue or something, or forest residue as a way to do carbon sequestration, what would have happened if I just left that residue in the field? What would it have done to plant growth? What would it have done to natural carbon sequestration in the soil? And then we got to lower the cost of direct air capture and power it with renewable energy in ways that do not compete with fossil fuel replacement. So I mentioned, solar thermal, geothermal, that's renewable energy that can be used for regenerating the sorbents. All right. You might recall early in my presentation, I said that we basically have to deploy every year an amount of solar and wind about double what we deployed in our record year of 2020. And just to point out, I don't think that's such a big thing to do, especially when you consider all the savings from getting off fossil fuel emissions. But I want to point out something, what this country can do when it puts its mind to it. This is 1944. This is the Ford Motor Company Willow Run, Michigan plant. It produced cars until President Roosevelt told them, you're not going to produce cars anymore. You're going to start producing planes now. So it converted from cars to producing B-24 bombers. And at the height of its production in 1944, it produced a complete B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if you look down this assembly line, and that's several football fields long, that assembly line, all you see are brand new B-24 bombers. A major reason why we won World War II is we simply outproduced by huge amounts what Japan and Germany could do. If the US can do this, putting in twice the amount we did in 2020 of wind and solar every year, to me, is not that tough a challenge. Okay, so that's my presentation. I just want to point out for people who haven't had enough punishment in my presentation, there's another presentation coming up on Wednesday, March 31st. These are East Coast times, so it'll start at 8 a.m. It'll go from 8 to 12 Mountain Time. And Jeff and I are going to both present a little bit shorter version of what you saw today in that presentation. And then this report that was done by the National Academy of Sciences, and then one that was done by Jeffrey Sachs et al. From Columbia University, and then finally a presentation by Clean Energy for Biden. We're looking at what the Biden administration is going to do. But these are all carbon or decarbonization reports. And you don't certainly need to attend ours again. You've seen this one. But you might want to tune in, at 9 a.m. starting for Steve Bacala's presentation. And you're certainly welcome to attend ours again as well. But you might put that in your calendar. And you can take my slides will be available on the CREST website as a PDF, and so you'll have that, or you can take a picture with your camera of that if you want to register for that website, for that webinar. So that's what I have. Again, at the bottom there is the link to our report. You can download the PDF. It's a 120-page report. And that's a lot of information I gave you. Thank you for your patience. And Jeff and I will be happy to answer your questions. I asked Jeff if he could just take on the difficult ones, but we welcome all your questions.
Fantastic. Awesome, Chuck. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. We'll hop right into the Q&A. This is one of the first questions from near the beginning of the presentation. Why isn't hydropower included in the renewable energy list? 97% of dams are not electrified / do not generate electricity. Much potential there.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I mean, certainly new hydropower is an issue because, when you create a reservoir, you bury the vegetation, and that vegetation decomposes into both methane and CO2. And so there's an issue with new reservoirs. The question of powering existing reservoirs, interesting question. I've heard more about run-of-the-river hydropower than powering existing reservoirs, but that's a tough question, so I might let Jeff handle that one. Jeff, are you on?
I am, Chuck. Thank you. And awesome job in that presentation. I think I totally resonate with everything you said. Regarding the potential for hydropower, I agree that building new hydropower is clearly a difficulty in many jurisdictions, not only in the United States, even Brazil. They are, the local communities in Brazil are, adamantly opposed to building new hydropower dams. But here in the United States, I think there was a recent report that NREL did for the Department of Energy looking at how you can make use of all the existing dams that don't make use of hydropower generation, and how we can try to capitalize on the energy generation potential that exists there on these dams that are there mainly for flood control reasons or for other reasons, but they currently do not generate electricity. And there is a significant opportunity to produce more electricity at those facilities.
Do you recall what the potential was there? Because I think that's a really good question.
I'm going to need to go back and review that, but
okay.
Given that, for example, hydropower produces, I'm trying to remember, roughly, is it 700? No, I'm sorry. I don't want to make a false statement, so I'm going to have retract that.
Okay. The other thing, I think that was a good question. It's probably something that we should have a number for. The other thing, too, is that there are a lot of reservoirs, and potentially you could run pipelines between them and use them for pumped hydro storage. Many of you probably know that in Guanella Pass above Georgetown, Xcel has a pumped hydro plant for storage. And in that case, you have what's called a Francis turbine, and you pump from the low reservoir to the high reservoir when you have lots of electricity, and when there's high demand, you can run backwards through it and generate electricity. So there's potential for the reservoirs, as the questioner said. I guess there's potential for new electricity generation. But if you build those pipelines, there may also be potential for pumped hydro storage, which would help enable variable renewables on the grid. And Jeff, I'm sorry, I had meant to, at the end of my presentation, specifically asked you if there's anything you wanted to add that I hadn't said. Anything you want to add to what I covered?
Only that you crushed it, Chuck. That was an awesome presentation.
Okay, thanks. Okay, next question.
Terrific. Massive electrification is a great idea, though does that decrease the resilience of the grid systems? For example, in Texas, if everyone is dependent on the same grid?
Jeff, I could take a shot at that, but you're really the electricity sector guy, so I'm going to let you take a shot at it.
Well, Chuck, thank you. I'll just say that, many people have questioned the what will happen if every home in the United States is electrified and there's no longer a gas connection, and what will happen to the resiliency of that home's electricity supply. Well, it turns out that for the most part, people's gas furnace or gas boiler need electricity in order to operate. So I don't think there's going to be a huge difference in resiliency when it comes to these, strange events that occur, like in Texas. If you don't have electricity, or if your gas doesn't work, it doesn't matter. You're going to be stranded no matter what. So we have to focus on the bigger picture questions of adoption to climate change and how we deal with this question of, these fundamental changes in our energy security that occur. And, just for example, in my house, I happen to have a gas boiler, and if I don't have electricity, it doesn't matter if my gas supply is working or not. So if you remove my gas supply from the equation, it's not going to make a difference for me whether or not I'm able to heat my house or not. But on the other hand, I'll make this minor nuance. I do have an electric fireplace that does operate independent of whether or not the electricity supply is there or not. So, there's some nuance there, but we really have to focus on these questions of cybersecurity and resilience that are going to become much more important in the future.
The questioner mentioned Texas. Texas is different because ERCOT is its own grid. And so I think there are a lot of problems that have surfaced about what happened in Texas. I mean, clearly they weren't ready for the cold weather. Their plants weren't equipped for cold weather. They felt severe weather didn't occur often enough. They had a simultaneous demand of gas, natural gas, for both electricity and heating. And that was too much demand on the gas, in addition to the failures that they had associated with freezing. But ERCOT, being a separate grid, couldn't pull in electricity from other areas, and that's a real limitation. So this is where interconnection is important. The other thing I'll say, and I'm sort of similar. I'm looking at electrifying my home. I have rooftop PV, but I have a natural gas furnace, and that furnace is not going to operate if there's no electricity and the fan can't operate. But one thing is that with rooftop PV, if you have a home battery, or if we get to a point where your car battery can be hooked into the home, then your PV can operate even if the grid is down. And so if you have sunshine during the day, you can use that electricity. So, rooftop PV, it can be more expensive than centralized PV, because centralized PV has an economy of scale associated with its installation. But rooftop PV gives the individual homeowner some resilience on his or her own. And also, by having the PV spread out on many rooftops, it also gives you that spatial diversity, which also gives you some resilience. So anyway, that was another good question.
Here's the next question. How can politicians help to create a national grid? Unlike pipeline, FERC cannot simply okay building transmission across state lines.
Well, Jeff, that's probably another electric sector question for you.
Wow, that's
electricity questions.
Yeah, that's a really difficult one. And I would say that this falls under the jurisdiction of the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, more than anyone else. Traditionally, FERC has yielded a lot of jurisdiction to state government regulatory agencies when it comes to allowing transmission lines to cross state borders. But there is some administrative flexibility, I think, that FERC could exercise and to encourage states or to force states to allow more transmission capacity to be built and permitted across state lines. This is really a hugely important issue. And I thank the person for raising this question, because as Chuck noted earlier, the NREL SEAM study noted that if you allow more interconnection across regions through transmission capacity, you can achieve pretty enormous cost savings. And not only that, you can integrate variable renewable sources of electricity way more easily than would otherwise be the case. So I think this is a hugely important federal energy policy question.
Yeah, two thoughts come to mind regarding this question. I think I mentioned earlier in my presentation that there's a project in the Midwest where they're looking at building transmission along railroad rights of way. So those are existing rights of way, which would make building transmission somewhat easier. And the other thing, too, is I was in a meeting the other day, and one of the people in the meeting was discussing what are called grid enhancing technologies. So there's been quite a bit of work lately on making the argument that the existing transmission system is heavily underutilized. And so there are various means to get around that. One of them is what's called dynamic line ratings. So, an electric line can carry a certain amount of electricity before it gets too hot. If it gets too hot, it can sag. It can cause a fire. We saw that happen with PG&E, for example. But those ratings are pretty conservative, and they don't vary with the weather. So some people have suggested dynamic ratings that vary with the outdoor temperature, that vary with the wind speed, so you can actually computer control your transmission and move electricity into different lines and get more electricity down each line if you have more flexibility in what's called dynamic rating. And then the idea of computer controls that look for the best optimal way to route electricity around areas that are congested, for example. So there are a number of people in the industry that feel that digital computer technologies in a 21st century grid can get a lot more out of the existing transmission system.
Will major breakthroughs in innovation more likely come from government-funded research labs like NREL, or will the private sector, for example, Exxon or VW, which has more of the competitive edge?
Oh boy, one of the things, I think, Bill Gates has been talking a lot about climate change in recent years, and he's a very smart guy, and he's an incredible philanthropist now, and he certainly does have good ideas on a lot of different topics. But I think one of the things he talks about the need for lots of innovation, and I'm certainly all for innovation. I mean, I spent most of my career as a researcher, but one thing I want to point out is that I showed you that graph early on. Existing wind and solar are the cheapest forms of electricity. And so, yes, we can make them better, but the major thing we have to do is not develop new energy technologies. We have to deploy the solutions that we already have. We got to get them out there fast. The other thing I want to say is that there are things called learning curves that are associated with deployment. Why have lithium-ion batteries come down in price so much? Because of Tesla, because of laptops, the proliferation of lithium-ion batteries due to learning curves, due to competition, has really driven the cost down. So it's really, in terms of innovation, lots of innovation comes out of the laboratories. Windows in my house have low E coatings on them. That came out of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. NREL has come out with a lot of advances in photovoltaics and other technologies. So there are a lot of technologies that come out of the labs, that come out of universities, and also come out of industry. So in terms of innovation, they can come from all those areas. But I just want to caution that at this point, I would argue deployment is the number one thing we have to focus on, and innovation and learning curve improvements will emanate out of deployment. Jeff, do you want to add anything to that?
I'll add one more thing to that, Chuck. I'll note that during the Trump administration, organizations like the National Renewable Energy Laboratory were more focused on what we call the fundamental research and development questions rather than the more applied ones. And now, given the change of administrations, we are ramping up to, rapidly change to a deployment-oriented approach. And they're very big, they're significantly different things to do especially when you're focused on things like environmental equity and justice and things like that. And we are struggling to deal with that transition, and I think I think we can do it, but we're going to have to go through a lot of changes in how we think about things and how we react.
One thing I want to mention about R&D, back in the Clinton administration, the late 90s, Clinton had a presidential council of advisors on science and technology. And they were, I think Congress pushed for them to do a study on what is the value of government dollars spent on R&D. And what they found, a couple interesting things. First, and I forget the exact number, but a dollar spent on government R&D produced many, many more dollars in terms of value to the economy. That was one thing. But the other thing that was interesting was all the stuff that came out of government-funded R&D, 80% of the benefits were outside the area where the R&D originally was performed. In other words, R&D, fundamental R&D, like Jeff was explaining, has broad application. So it's really valuable, and you can't even tell where it's going to be most valuable. I would say because climate change is a true crisis, at this point, we need to focus on solving that crisis, getting carbon dioxide emissions to zero, getting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So that's more focused research. We still need to do the basic R&D because God knows where that's going to benefit us. But from the climate change standpoint, I think we need pretty focused research and development and deployment. The last D, RD&D, deployment, is really important.
For sure. And I think we have time for just a couple more questions here. Here's one here. Can you comment on the organization that controls building codes that have just outlawed municipalities from setting their own stricter codes, for example, outlawing gas in new constructions?
Oh, I think I can take the initial shot at that, and if Chuck has anything to add.
Yeah.
Those are state government legislative organizations that have basically been lobbied by their natural gas stakeholders to say that we should not allow this to happen in our state. And these are states like Arkansas and whatever. I can reel off maybe 12 states that have already said that they will not allow a banning of natural gas in their economies, but it's the legislatures in those states that have made those decisions.
Thanks, Jeff. I mentioned Berkeley and some other cities are requiring new buildings to go all electric, and they've run into lawsuits. They've got a lot of pushback from the gas industry. I know in Denver, in Colorado, we're looking at legislation to electrify buildings. And one of the groups that's very concerned are the Pipe Fitters Association, the Pipe Fitters Union, because a lot of their work involves installing natural gas line. So I really think, as we make this energy transition, we have to be conscious of these things and figure out ways to help labor make the transition and get out ahead of that. So anyway, I think all these things, we're talking about, we use the word transformation. It seems stronger than transition. We use the word transformation in the title of our report because it really is a big change in a huge industry. And there's going to be lots of pushback. And so we have to be smart about how we deal with that. And we have to be, conscious of the pain it can cause people and how can we minimize that pain.
And I think we have time for one more question. What will have to happen to reduce the costs of expanding electric light rail to more areas of Colorado, and especially, this is the important part, to reduce traffic to the I-70 during ski season?
Oh gosh, these are tough questions. I think there have been studies, extending a rail into the mountains, and I think there. But I'm not familiar with the cost of those studies. Have you seen any of those, Jeff?
Chuck, these are great questions. I cannot comment on this one.
I think the answer is we don't know. But it's a good question. It's a really good question. Let me say that you can see my email address there. If you have any comments on the presentation, ways you think it could be improved, or questions that you have that you didn't have a chance to ask during this webinar, or you asked a question and it wasn't answered, like the light rail one, send me an email. I'll do my best to dig up answers for you.
Perfect. Well, Chuck, thank you so much for attending tonight and speaking for BCRES. We really appreciate you coming in to share your insight on your report. Jeff, thank you for being here as well to help answer questions. Guys, both of you, thank you so much for all the hard work you guys have put in, and we really appreciate the opportunity to have you speak for us.